1856 Ohio. The macabre mystery of the triplets that not even science can explain. It began as most tragedies do, in silence. On a fog-thick April morning in the year 1856 in the rural township of Claybrook, Ohio, just a split rail fence from the Indiana border, a woman named Temperance Wilkes gave birth to 3 children. No doctor was present. No midwife had been summoned. Her screams were muffled beneath a sky so low and heavy it felt as if the heavens themselves had turned to soil. The Wilkes property sat on the edge of the Black Hollow region, a narrow stretch of pine woods that locals once believed to be the grazing path of something called the Long Dead Light. No one knew what that meant. Children recited the name in dares. Old folks crossed themselves if you mentioned it at dusk. Temperance's husband, Elijah, was a quiet carpenter who had lost 2 fingers in the war with Mexico, and never spoke of it again. Their home, 3 rooms stacked around a stone hearth, was built by Elijah's father and carried the smell of damp earth, boiled potatoes, and pipe ash. When the triplets were born, 3 boys, all breathing, all silent, Elijah was the first to speak. He said, "This ain't right." They named the boys Isaiah, Silas, and Jonah. Each one had a mole under the left ear and a crooked left thumb. They didn't cry, not at birth, not the next day, not at all. When hungry, they'd suck on their knuckles in unison until Temperance fed them. They rarely blinked. Neighbors came with baked bread and fearful glances. Reverend Amos Delbridge from the Claybrook Church of the Narrow Way brought a jug of anointing oil and baptized all 3 without asking. He called them miraculous. Then, under his breath, or unnatural. By the time the boys were 1 year old, the whispers had begun. The town of Claybrook, if it could be called a town, had no main road, only a horse trail that wound through dead cornfields and pine stumps. It had a single church, a 1-room schoolhouse, and a general store run by a man with a missing eye and a pet raccoon. Families were large, secrets were larger. Most folk buried their shame under frost and scripture. The Wilkes boys did not grow like normal children. At 1 year they could already walk. At 2 they could write their names. Identical penmanship, backward slant. At 3, they stopped responding to their individual names entirely. If you called for Jonah, all 3 would turn. If you scolded Isaiah, the others wept. One late summer afternoon, Temperance caught all 3 boys sitting cross-legged in the middle of the parlor, staring at the fire. The flames weren't lit. They were whispering something. Not English, not anything Temperance could place. The town midwife, Sister Agatha Moore, had helped birth nearly every child in Claybrook since 1832. She'd retired before the triplets, but rumors brought her back to the Wilkes home when the boys turned 4. She examined their eyes, their teeth. She held their hands and asked if they knew their prayers. They did. All of them. In Greek. Agatha left without touching her tea. That Sunday, she left a sealed envelope with the Reverend. In it a single sentence written in shaking hand. They were not born. They were retrieved. The first to leave Claybrook was Sister Agatha. 2 weeks after her visit to the Wilkes home, her boarding room was found empty. Her bed untouched. A chipped saucer of black tea resting cold on the windowsill. The mirror in her room had been turned to face the wall, and her Bible was found buried beneath the floorboards, open to a passage that had been circled again and again in blood, red ink. They shall multiply like locusts, and none shall know from whence they came. Her shoes were still at the foot of her bed. Her nightdress draped across the chair. No note, no farewell. Only her rocking chair, still swaying when the landlady entered. By age 5, the Wilkes triplets had become a spectacle. Not for mischief, not for tantrums, but for their sameness, an eerie, mechanical sameness. They no longer played a part. They no longer answered questions unless asked 3 times. At church, they recited psalms in perfect harmony, heads tilted at the same angle, lips moving fractionally out of sync, as if someone were dragging their voices across a gramophone needle. Temperance stopped attending town socials. Elijah worked later into the night, carving crucifixes into beams, floorboards, even the kitchen table. One morning, a schoolteacher named Miss Frances Daly visited unannounced. She had come to offer early instruction, alphabet, sums, penmanship, but when she stepped inside the Wilkes home, she stopped cold. All 3 boys were kneeling in the hallway, facing the wall, their fingers locked behind their backs, their foreheads gently pressing against the faded blue wallpaper. Frances asked, "Boys, what are you doing?" Jonah, or maybe Isaiah, whispered, "We're waiting for the shadow to pass." Then all 3 turned to her at once. Frances Daly left Claybrook the next day. She took no pay. She refused to speak of what she saw. But she did write a single sentence in the ledger kept by the schoolhouse. Not of mind nor of learning, but of memory. They are remembering something that does not belong to them. That summer, Temperance began to change. She stopped brushing her hair. She stopped calming the boys. She grew forgetful, frightened, sometimes violent. More than once, she was seen wandering the edge of Black Hollow in her nightdress, barefoot, whispering the names of her sons over and over, sometimes mixing them up, sometimes calling a fourth name no one recognized. Malachi. It started with the dreams. Temperance Wilkes began waking in the middle of the night soaked in sweat, her hands bruised from clutching the sheets too tightly. She told Elijah that something was watching her from inside the wardrobe mirror. Not a person, she was careful with her words, but a feeling. Elijah, never much for feelings, said nothing, but he began leaving the lantern on in their bedroom. That small gesture frightened her more than anything. The triplets Isaiah, Silas, and Jonah grew quieter. At 5 years old, they no longer spoke at all. Not even to one another. They communicated through glances, subtle tilts of the head, shared silence. When one tripped or fell, the others flinched. When one was punished, the others sulked. When one bled, the others paled. The town doctor, Edwin Clark, visited at Temperance's request. He tapped their knees, flashed a candle before their eyes, asked them to draw a horse. They drew the same image. A pale horse with no face. The drawings were identical, down to the angle of the charcoal strokes. Clark never returned. Small animals began disappearing. Cats mostly, chickens too. Once a neighbor's calf. The Wilkes family denied involvement, but one morning, Elijah found all 3 boys standing in the muddy field behind the house, shoeless and blank-faced, staring down at a dead bird split open with twine and a bent spoon. Elijah buried it. But that night the same bird reappeared on their porch, untouched, whole. The local children began to stay away. Some said the triplets stared too long. Others claimed the boys moved without making noise, even across wooden floors. One boy, Micah Delridge, told his mother that he saw Jonah Wilkes walking backward through the woods, his mouth open wide like he was swallowing the wind. Temperance tried to bring the boys to church again. They screamed when the bell rang and wouldn't cross the threshold. Reverend Delbridge refused to allow them in again. They bring with them a silence deeper than death. He told Elijah. There's no scripture to quiet that. Then came the fire. Late one September evening, the chimney stones collapsed inward while the family was sleeping. The blaze scorched half the cabin, but no one was harmed. The triplets were already outside when Temperance and Elijah escaped. They were sitting in a row on the cold ground barefoot, watching the flames eat their home. They didn't blink, they didn't speak, they only smiled. And still, no one could explain the dreams. Not just Temperance, others too. Sister Agatha woke one night to the sound of 3 knocks on her door. When she opened it, no one was there, but on her porch, a small pile of corn husks arranged in the shape of a triangle, and inside it, a dead mouse, its tongue severed. Another neighbor, Clement Hargrove, claimed he dreamt of being a child again, locked in a wooden box while a voice hummed a lullaby in reverse. He shot himself 3 days later. The town began to whisper about the Black Hollow again. Old stories, long buried, were unearthed like rotting bones. People remembered the disappearances in 1794, the 5 children who'd wandered into the woods and never returned, the preacher who'd gone mad and nailed a Bible shut, the screams from underground heard during the eclipse of 1811. They said the hollow didn't just hide things. It remembered. The triplets were 6 when the man from Columbus arrived. Dr. Franklin Merrill, an academic from the Ohio Lunatic Asylum, came in a black carriage with brass hinges and a leather satchel full of notebooks. He stayed at the inn for 2 nights and visited the Wilkes house daily. He asked the boys questions. He recorded their answers. What startled him most was not their silence, but what they said when they finally spoke. On the 4th day, unprompted, all 3 said in perfect harmony, "We are what came before the light." Dr. Merrill left that night. His satchel was found weeks later, abandoned at the edge of the Black Hollow. Inside dozens of notes, a torn hymnal, and a small drawing of 3 identical boys standing in front of a mirror that reflected none of them. Temperance began keeping a journal. She hid it beneath the floorboards in the kitchen. Her final entry, "They speak when I sleep. I hear them through the walls. Not with words, but with memory. I am forgetting who I was. I am remembering someone else. I am remembering a name that is not mine." Elijah left in the middle of the night. No note, no goodbye. His axe was missing. It was the winter of 1862 when the first outsider vanished. Her name was Claire Mead, a traveling schoolmistress from Cincinnati, hired to teach in Claybrook's one-room schoolhouse. She was 26, recently widowed, and wore a dark mourning bonnet even on sunny days. Claire had boarded with the Wilkes family for only 9 days before she disappeared. The last anyone saw of her was in the parlor, seated in the rocking chair, with the triplets at her feet. Silas had placed a pine cone in her lap. Jonah was humming, and Isaiah, it was said, simply watched her face as if waiting for something to crawl out of it. When Elijah returned from the woods with firewood, she was gone. Her bonnet remained. So did her shoes. But not a single footprint led away from the house. Temperance didn't speak of it. Not to Elijah. Not to the sheriff who came by 2 weeks later. Not even to herself. Instead, she stitched a thick wool curtain over the attic door and placed iron nails, cold-forged and blessed, along every windowsill. Old folk magic, her mother's kind, the kind her church once told her to fear. But that winter, she returned to it. She also stopped calling the boys by name. The triplets turned 7 in a silence so thick it seemed to swallow the wind itself. The pine trees no longer swayed. Even the raccoons that rummaged the Wilkes smokehouse were gone. Then the house began to change. It started subtly, furniture moved by inches in the night. A hairline crack appeared in the hearth and widened each morning. Cold spots settled in the children's room that no fire could chase off, and at 3:13 each morning, a single bell would sound, though there were no bells in the house. Temperance and Elijah took to sleeping in shifts. On March 4th, Elijah discovered a hidden crawlspace beneath the floorboards of the boys' bedroom. He never told Temperance. But that night, she woke to find him feverish, clutching his Bible, his nails bloodied, repeating the same verse again and again. He maketh the deep to boil like a pot. He maketh a path to shine after him. The next morning, Elijah boarded up the crawlspace and nailed 3 iron horseshoes over the doorframe. The boys didn't resist. They only stared, like they already knew what was down there. A month later, it snowed ash. Not from any fire, not from any known source. Just ash, fine and gray, drifting down in the night across Claybrook's rooftops. The preacher's widow described it as snow that tasted like burnt teeth. Local legend would later call it the morning dust, the moment when the town finally stopped pretending. That Sunday, the church bell tolled once, then shattered. The triplets stopped attending service after that. By autumn, more families began to leave Claybrook. Those who stayed lit lanterns at their doorsteps and salted the edges of their land. No one approached the Wilkes property. The general store closed. The schoolhouse stood empty. Even the raccoon at the general store went missing. But the triplets, Isaiah, Silas, Jonah, thrived. They never grew taller. But their eyes aged. That's what folks said. That their eyes looked ancient. Like they remembered things no child should. On the eve of their 8th birthday, Elijah entered the woods with a rope and a lantern. He never came back. Temperance waited until morning. Then she locked herself in the attic and burned every cradle, every toy, every photograph. She wrote a single line in her sewing ledger, beneath a drawing of 3 circles. They are not mine. They are only passing through. Then she vanished. 2. The house stood empty after that. Yet smoke was still seen from the chimney on moonless nights. And travelers spoke of 3 figures, child-sized, standing in the window, watching the road. No one dared knock. No one dared look too long, because if you did, sometimes they blinked in perfect unison. By 1865, Claybrook, Ohio was a ghost town in everything but name. 24 families had vanished, either swallowed by the woods or pulled away by superstition and silence. The Claybrook Church of the Narrow Way was boarded shut. Its pews were overturned, its stained glass warped by mildew, and its bell tower filled with crowds that never blinked. But the Wilkes house remained, still standing, still warm, and still occupied. On a bitter November night, 5 years to the day after Claire Mead's disappearance, a circuit judge from Chillicothe named Edmund Larrabee arrived in Claybrook. He had been sent by the state after multiple letters, unsigned and frantic, warned of ungodly acts and unnatural survivals. He brought with him a marshal, 2 field hands, and a doctor. They were never heard from again. Only their horses returned, stirred with sweat and foam, their eyes wide as if they'd seen a second death. 3 days later, a letter arrived at the Chillicothe courthouse. It was written in Latin, signed only ISJ. Inside the envelope, a lock of silver hair, coarse and cinned at the ends. Local legend holds that a man named Horace Bell, the only blacksmith in Claybrook to survive the final winter, watched the Wilkes house from atop burnt hill with a looking glass. He claimed that once a month, Precisely when the moon was new, the triplets walked the perimeter of the house barefoot, chanting a name not spoken in any language known to man. Bell called it the Circle of Remembering. He said they moved like they were rehearsing something, practicing for a day no one else could see. That spring, the townsfolk began hearing the wind wrong. It no longer rustled through trees. It rasped like whispered breath. Barn doors swung on hinges that weren't there. Dead crops moved. And at the edge of every mirror left in town, 3 silhouettes flickered, just beyond the glass, out of sync with the viewer's motion. One woman, Margaret Cleves, cracked every mirror in her home with a coal shovel before hanging herself in the parlor. Her final note read, "They know I've seen it. And now it's inside me." Meanwhile, the Wilkes house aged backwards. Its roof, once black with mold, turned the color of polished walnut. Its broken windows mended. Its porch, sagging and wind-warped, straightened over a single night. Inside, the hearth burned clean, though no one stoked it. And yet, according to the one child who dared to peek through the kitchen window, it still smelled of scorched wool and candle wax. She said the 3 boys sat at the table, eyes closed, as if in prayer. Each one had a small object in front of him, a strip of tattered linen, a stone shaped like a tooth, and a black feather with no kill. By 1870, the only remaining resident of Claybrook was Reverend Amos Delbridge. He had boarded himself inside the church, now decayed and roofless, and took to writing a journal with ink made from crushed berries and soot. One entry read, "I hear the whispering again. 3 voices, braided like rope, twisting through the boards beneath me." Another, "They were not born. They are not brothers, they are echoes." And in his final entry, dated only, "The longest night," he wrote, "They are preparing. I see now. The house is not a house, it is a mouth. And they are the breath within it." Delbridge was found seated in the pulpit, arms spread wide, mouth filled with black ash. His eyes were gone. But on the walls of the church, burned into the wood itself, were 3 perfect handprints, each one a left-handed, each with a crooked thumb. Since then, no one has returned to Claybrook. Maps removed its roads. The post office stopped deliveries. And in the 1903 census, Claybrook was officially listed as uninhabited terrain. But if you drive west from Union City and follow the deer trails off Highway 36, there's still a clearing, still a chimney, still, some say, 3 faint silhouettes in the window, waiting. Nothing stays buried, not blood, not memory, not what came before memory. Inscription found on a charred wooden plaque beneath the Wilkes hearthstone, unearthed in 1931. By the turn of the century, Claybrook had faded from maps, minds, and families, except one. In 1927, a theology student named Catherine Delbridge, daughter of the late Reverend Amos, was combing through inherited journals from her grandfather's estate when she discovered a strange set of writings bound in twine. They were smeared with coal dust, ash, and dried sap. In them were symbols, chants, dates, and 3 names repeated over and over: Isaiah, Silas, Jonah. She became obsessed. Catherine tracked down what little remained: a faded land deed signed by Elijah Wilkes in 1852, one brittle photograph of the Wilkes house taken during a railway survey, and an anonymous pamphlet distributed by a fringe religious group in Pennsylvania that simply read, "The circle is not broken. It waits in clay and time." By 1930, Catherine had disappeared. She was last seen boarding a horse-drawn cart bound for what had once been Claybrook. No one knows who drove the cart. No one ever saw it return. But in 1932, surveyors from the Wilkes administration reached the outskirts of Black Hollow to assess timberland value. One of the men, a veteran named Thomas Crane, wandered off the trail and came back 3 hours later, barefoot, clothes torn, and whispering. The only words he ever spoke after that were, "They still remember her name." He was committed to a sanitarium in Dayton, died in 1953, still whispering in his sleep. Years passed, the world forgot, until 1971. That year, a chemical company sent a small team to survey rural land for industrial dumping. Satellite imagery showed an anomaly near the Ohio-Indiana line, a dead zone where nothing grew and radio signals fell to static. The aerial photos revealed something odd, barely visible. 3 concentric circles burned into the earth, each one precisely 33 feet apart. At the center, a structure, perfectly square. No door, no roof, no windows. It had not been there in 1965. They sent in a field engineer named Wallace Vintner to take soil samples. He approached the structure. He never made it back. Only his camera was recovered, outside the circle. It had no film inside, but the lens was melted into the shape of a left hand, crooked thumb. In 1988, the land was seized by the state under mysterious circumstances. The official reasons cited: persistent magnetic irregularities and structural instability. Unofficially, the site is now listed under a Department of Energy shadow classification labeled JW33, CR Intraocular Ritual Nexus JW Jonah Wilkes 3030A. The known radius of containment, no further explanation exists. But the story doesn't end there. Because as of March 2023, a series of YouTube videos began circulating from a user known only as eCode3. The videos are short, no voices, no music, only a static drone. Each one is the same: a shot of a forest clearing, a chimney, and a house that appears and disappears every 33 seconds. But in the final video, posted at exactly 3003 AM, 3 boys walk into frame, barefoot, hand in hand. They look directly at the camera. Then the screen goes black. For one frame, just one. 3 names flash, each distorted but visible: SAH, Silas, Geomatch, Silosur. Some say the Wilkes triplets were never children, that they were echoes of something older than the town, older than language. Others believe they were summoned, not born. That black hollow was never meant to be settled, only sealed. But the most disturbing theory, that they never left, and they're still waiting for someone to finish what they began. Because somewhere, even now, the house remembers. The hearth still breathes, and if you're quiet enough, you might hear it: 3 voices, 1 breath, speaking your name.